First, we have to see that most of these people remain within their own countries. They are not refugees. I know BBC is consistently telling about refugees in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, where people remain within their own countries. I think we have to be very careful with this terminology because it has a direct impact and a direct link to their rights, their protections. Who is a refugee? A refugee is someone who has lost the protection of his own government, who arrives in another country uninvited, who is a foreigner, tolerated, assisted, but basically uninvited. A second-class citizen. I still remember the man on TV who was displaced from New Orleans during Katrina, being very angry, saying, "I'm not a refugee, I'm an American." And he was right. Because if you're displaced, but remaining with your own country, by the effects of climate change, you remain a citizen of that country with the full rights available to the population of that country. So the first source of protection, the first source of rights for these people are the human rights that are available to the population of a country by virtue of national laws, national constitutions, but very importantly by international human rights law. The problem is, what does it mean, these general guarantees, if you're being displaced by the effects of climate change? What does it mean, for instance, do you have a right to return? Do you have a right to repossess your property you have lost? Can they tell you to go to a camp, etc., etc.? All issues we are dealing with on a daily basis when talking about internally displaced persons. The good news is the international community has a kind of a framework for dealing with these situations. Unlike for refugees, it's true there is no international convention on the rights of internally displaced persons. But there is an important UN document called the Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement. The Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement have been recognized by the UN General Assembly, by governments in general, as, and I quote here the relevant resolutions, an important international framework for the protection of internally displaced persons. This document defines internally displaced persons as people who have to leave their homes, either because they flee or because they have to avoid the consequences, the bad consequences of not only conflict, but also natural and man-made disaster, human-made disaster. So the definition always already covers people we are talking about. People who have to flee, have to leave, are forced to leave, but do not cross an internationally recognized border. So I would say we do have a normative framework derived from human rights for these people. We have much less of clear-cut law when it comes to people who cross international borders. That's where we have the gap. Again, they are not refugees. Refugees are people who are persecuted by their own government, who have, as we lawyers say, lost the protection by their own government, who cannot turn to their government for protection because they are looked at as the enemies of the government. People displaced by natural disasters, slow onset, sudden onset, are not in this situation. Governments will be ready to assist them, but not always able to do it. But it's a different situation. So what we need is not asylum, what we need is protection for these people, admission to other countries, for instance, during a sudden onset disaster where the government does not have the capacity to look after these people, to assist them, to protect them. What we need is cooperation across borders. What we need is something like temporary admission, temporary protection for these people till they can go back. This is kind of the approach we are promoting today. This is the kind of approach I think both the humanitarian organizations, human rights organizations and governments concerned want to push within the framework of the Copenhagen process. As one of the outcomes of the debate in Bonn, we have an Article 25 with lots of brackets. This is about adaptation frameworks. But I think it is now quite accepted, not yet achieved, but quite accepted, that responding to displacement, both internal, external, and also to migration, but you will talk about that in a minute, to have a basis for cooperation between governments to assist and protect these people has to be a part of adaptation. And I think that's our message, to get that text, to build a strong normative framework on which we can build upon. This is the only way to ensure that these people are not becoming second-class citizens, that they are not becoming people forgotten, lost, that we can protect their human rights, all their rights, both civil and political, as well as social, economic, and cultural rights. Thank you.
Walter, I know you're going to have to leave quite soon, so could I just ask you a question that arises, at least in my mind, listening to you, and that is, how do you do it? What Craig was saying, how do we move away from the exhortations to actually make sure that, say, India, where I come from, is more welcoming of climate migrants from Bangladesh?
When it comes to the large majority remaining within their own countries, internally displaced persons, I feel that governments overall are quite willing to take on that responsibility. Interestingly enough, if all goes well, on 22nd or 23rd of October of this year, the African governments within the framework of the African Union will adopt a convention on protection of and assistance for internally displaced persons in Africa. This convention is not only covering those displaced by armed conflict, but also those displaced by natural and human-made disasters. And that's a very important recognition. And I hope this will be a model for other countries. We're also talking about establishing the appropriate legal frameworks in these countries to bring in a human rights perspective to adaptation measures, to develop disaster management responses that are based on the notion of human rights. I'm traveling around quite often these days. Just came back, for instance, from Bangkok, where we had a regional conference, where we're talking to the disaster responders. And they're very open to that kind of an approach, to integrate a human rights approach. Cross-border is more difficult. But I think if we can establish a framework where it's not about admitting these people permanently, but as long as an affected country needs that kind of help, and then we can bring them back and reintegrate them, then I think we will have some opening. And that's again very important in the framework of Copenhagen, to establish that cooperative framework.
Thanks, Walter. You know, Walter Kälin has to go quite soon. Is there anyone who would like to ask him in particular a question, so that we can make full use of his expertise for the next 10 minutes or so?
Thanks. It's Manuel Carvalho from the International Center for Migration and Health. It's not so much a question as a statement, and you say we've got to prevent them becoming second-class citizens. The reality is that they already are second-class citizens. The people who will have to move are the poor. They're disenfranchised already. And I'm not sure that I would agree with you when you say that governments are already committed or willing to do something for them, because if they were, they would have done so before. The problem that we're dealing with ultimately is not a new problem. It's an old problem that's taking on a new character, and maybe a more evident character. And I'm glad that climate change is forcing us to address this issue. But I just want to make that comment because I think it's very important that we understand who we're talking about. We're not talking about educated, middle-class, upper-class, urban people. We're talking about the rural poor. We're talking about the people who are living on the margins of society already. They're people that have basically been forgotten by their governments and international governments.
I would like probably don't know their rights either. Can we just get a quick response from Gordon?
Yes.
I would like to ask them.